should probably start recording now. We're recording the lectures so that we, in fact, will have an archive of some of the most interesting thinking on contemporary creative writing by the really gifted practitioners and artists and writers who will be giving them every year. The creative writing program established the Sharon Thesen Lectures, an opportunity for writers to get a chance to, in a fairly sustained and lengthy lecture, tackle key issues of contemporary writing, poetics, Canadian literature. One of the main motivations for beginning this lecture series was to honor Sharon Thesen, who's a renowned Canadian poet and editor, who was the first full professor in the Department of Creative Studies and is now a UBC professor emerita. She's really a national treasure, and we're celebrating for all that she contributes to British Columbian and Canadian literature, and all that she did to establish the creative writing program at UBCO from the day it opened in 2005. So just quickly, some details about the event. I'll introduce Sharon, ask her to say a few words. Then I'll introduce Kevin, who'll then give his talk. And then we'll open the chat to any questions. We'll read as many as we can get to. After that, we normally would have a nice wine and cheese, maybe next year. Just again, before I do the first introduction, just some special thanks to our staff at FCCS, Shauna Odlifson, who does our publicity, and Cassandra Northrup, who does so much behind the scenes, including helping us here tonight. Thanks to FCCS and the Department of Creative Studies. And of course, a special thanks to Sharon for her generosity and for all she's done for our program and for being here tonight. And of course, thank you, all of you, for coming, virtually coming to your computer. So let me just introduce Sharon. Sharon has written 12 books of poetry, including The Good Bacteria, Oh, I Am a Pink Shale, The Receiver. She's edited 2 editions of the New Long Poem Anthology, 2 editions of Charles Olson's correspondence with book designer Francis Bolderoff, and a Governor General Award-winning edition of the poems of Phyllis Webb. She's held various positions as editor at the Capilano Review, and while teaching at UBC Okanagan, co-edited Lake, a journal of arts and environment. And although retired, she continues to write and contribute to the development and conversation around Canadian poetics, recently writing the introduction to Anansi's reprinting of Paulette Giles's Waterloo Express. And just this week is launching her latest book, an innovative, startling, and original work, where she is a poet receiving the life story of her friend, Janet Gallant. I'm just going to give a little plug for the launch of that book, which will be next week. This book's a very interesting one. I just read it a couple of weeks ago. The 2 friends, Janet and Sharon, collaborated on a work that is more than oral history. It's a poetic rendering of voice and relationships, memory and emotion. It's a dazzling work that's a further example of Sharon at work in the realm of the imagination and its power. As she has said, only the imagination carries us forward. Sharon, would you like to say a few words?
Thank you, Nancy. And thank you, Kevin, for delivering the second of these annual lectures. The topic of tonight's lecture couldn't be more urgent and involving and evolving. How to teach and write in an ongoing, it seems, middle of a pandemic. Being in the middle of anything, a pandemic, a problem, a poem, a novel, is a fraught condition for who knows when or how the middle will lead into something else, any sort of ending or result, itself inevitably another beginning. By chance, I came across this stanza from a poem by James Longenbach. Quote, "The most difficult part about making something, and also the best, is existing in the middle, sustaining an act of radical imagination." Unquote. The surprise for me in this poem is that the example he gives is of making soup. Let's hope it turned out great. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Nancy. And thank you to UBC's Faculty of Creative and Critical Studies who are sponsoring this lecture series. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Well, I would like to introduce Kevin Chong. He's our most recent hire in the creative writing program here at UBCO. This was his first year with us. What a year, eh? He's teaching everything's on Zoom. But he taught for many years at UBC Vancouver, so we weren't too worried about throwing him in the deep end. He's a real master, where he studied creative writing himself. He's the author of 6 books of fiction and nonfiction. His works have been named Books of the Year by the Globe and Mail, the National Post, Amazon.ca, listed for a CBC Prize, BC Book Prize, a National Magazine Award, optioned for film and television, published in the US, Australia, Europe. His creative nonfiction and journalism have appeared in The Guardian, the Times Literary Supplement, The Rumpus, and South China Morning Post. His most recent book is a retelling of the 1947 Albert Camus novel, The Plague. His novel is the same name, The Plague, but this time it's the city of Vancouver that's quarantined with an infectious disease. It just sounds really very familiar. But this book was published in 2018. Currently, he's writing another novel and working on a TV adaptation of My Year of the Racehorse, his nonfiction account of owning a thoroughbred. So please welcome Kevin as he gives us his talk in the middle of it all on writing, teaching, and middles during a pandemic.
Nancy, thank you very much for those very kind and warm remarks. Sharon, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to speak and for your brilliant and insightful prefatory remarks. I really appreciate that. I'm going to share my screen now. Oops, I think I need to share my screen now. Still disabled. And so you can sort of avoid seeing my face writ large. That was the whole idea of me putting slides. All right. I'm hoping you can see this. All right. I've decided to write this as sort of an auto-fiction because I listened to John Lent's very brilliant talk last year, and I realized I don't have that sort of intellectual ammo. So I had to like kind of play fast and loose with the rules. Anyhow, this is a story, and it begins with part 1. I've known Kay, a fellow writer-teacher, for exactly 20 years. Both of our first books had been published in 2001. We did a few readings around that time and found that we had a lot in common. The last decade or so, as we moved into middle age, we moved apart. I've grown used to this. Decades-long friendships dropped, a curt email exchange, or a series of phone calls not returned. In fact, I've been the person doing the ghosting. After all, the human body replaces its entirety of its cells every 7 years, making you a new person. Why wouldn't you need a new set of friends? But COVID-19 brought this all into greater relief. You would run into an old friend in a park or supermarket, excited to see a familiar, albeit masked face. But then that feeling was chased down with your long simmering exhaustion with that same face, and the sense that even the most enduring friendships ran out of steam. Exhaustion, as it did everyone else, was ubiquitous. I had spent the year in a creatively and financially insolvent space. I hadn't written a word despite having weeks of quiet, uninterrupted time. Meanwhile, my work as a freelance writer had been drying up, and I only taught 1 or 2 classes as an adjunct. If not for government payouts, I would have had to move back in with my mother. And I was, of course, single. As a determinedly analog dater who refused to use an app, the pandemic meant a long stretch of loneliness. By contrast, Kay had fared well through the pandemic 1 year into it. He had finally achieved a long sought after promotion in academia. In the first months of lockdown, he had focused on his writing. Unlike many of our friends who found the isolation they normally crave too much when it was there, he actually wrote an entire manuscript. I'm embarrassed of my good fortune, Kay texted me. I feel like you're the only person I can tell this to. When I first met him, he seemed too peculiar and shut off to be anything other than a bachelor. But he was now married with children. Even before everything started, he had curtailed his evenings out. When he went to events, usually to support his students, we would exchange a few words in the corner before he left early. I sort of hated him, to be honest. The pandemic proved to give his last book, which was about infectious disease and quarantine, an accidental boost in publicity. I hated him for his projection of comfort and stability. Kay, from what I gleaned, even enjoyed teaching online. He claimed to be an introvert, which has become shorthand for sullen and terse. On social media, he posted infrequently, but I resented his circumspection, how he sidestepped political arguments. Half of my waking hours were devoted to arguing with randos about mask wearing, arguing with TERFs. Moreover, I lived alone in a second-story walk-up. The last of the magazines I once freelanced for had folded in the pandemic. My attempts to make up for that income weren't entirely successful. I was underemployed as a writing mentor. My students had been left disquieted by the pandemic, irritable, anxious, unable to write, unable to get along. And in my abundance of cautiously free time, I couldn't write at all. When Kay contacted me, I hesitated. He wanted to go for a walk. He wanted to catch up. I knew he wanted something out of me. Anytime you're around another writer, you risk having something taken from you. A job, a reputation at best, a life story and persona at worst. At least when you're a writer, too, you're free to take back if that other writer has something to give. And I knew I had less to lose than Kay. So I started writing this story. At the very least, it would get me back in the habit of writing. We met on a cool day early in the winter. A week previously, restrictions on outdoor gatherings had been placed, and the once unappealing idea of meeting friends outside propane-fueled fire pits under camping gazebos now felt like a lost luxury. We were left only to walk. I waved for him outside the coffee shop. Then I saw him emerge from his car and slip on a mask. The glasses were fogged when he approached. Like me, he looked stitched into his sweatpants. His tousled hair was now too thin, too dandruff-flecked to be considered even bookishly dashing. He apologized for being late, in spite of the fact that this locale was chosen by him, nearest home and not near mine. He offered to buy my coffee. I'm always in a rush, Kay told me. He explained how he needed to drop his sick child to his mother's house. If you've got kids, he said, it's a different kind of pandemic. Kay insisted on buying our coffee, his credit card already flashed and setting a destination to walk toward. Otherwise, he said, we end up having to decide where to go at the end of every block. He gave me two choices, either toward QE Park or Mountain View Cemetery. I chose the former. As we walked through the residential neighborhoods of Raleigh Park, we caught up on gossip quickly. None of us had seen our mutual friends in recent months. And even if we had, there wouldn't have been any love affairs or scandals to report. Everything was on hold. We talked about what we were reading and writing, or not reading and not writing. In a pause in our catching up, Kay, the writer-teacher, admitted that he was giving a keynote lecture on creative writing and creative writing pedagogy. A thought came out too forcefully, the way one pounces on a break in conversation to blurt out what's really been on their mind, to escape my notice. I've been thinking about middles. That's the subject of my talk, he added. Don't you think the middle of a story is the toughest part to teach? After all, Beginnings are sexy. That's why students love writing prologues with foreboding and anguish. And endings are, well, a relief. The middle is everything else. Actually, the middle is everything. I thought about Freytag's triangle, the decisive action that lost the story toward the tent pole of the climax in particularly. I taught it. I could see it in movies and TV shows and some books, but not in the novels I had written. Maybe that's why they never sold well. But I didn't see it in the novels I liked, some of which were widely admired, even if they weren't blockbusters. That was the thing I found hard about teaching creative writing, the need to create writing rules to have something to teach. To my detriment, I always felt the need to enumerate the exceptions and loopholes to each and every rule. But when you're learning anything, you just want it to seem simple. And the best writing does feel, if not simple, then inevitable. And yet it rarely fits snugly along Freytag's triangle. Eventually, we approach Main Street. Rather than continue west, we veered along the commercial artery. You realize how much space you take up when you're trying to walk abreast with someone during the age of social distancing. There's usually the inside walker who can keep in a straight line, and then the outside walker who needs to weave between parking meters, trees, and waste receptacles. When we passed Carson's books, I crashed into a newspaper box for a defunct Free Weekly. Kay stopped and asked if I was okay. Dusting myself, I took that moment to stare at the new stock in the bookstore. I could never resist used books and asked if Kay didn't mind if we went inside. He said he would take a look, even though he only read ebooks. Does that make me a terrible person, he asked. I already have enough paper books in my house. I figure they cost me an hour of paid labor every time I move. Quietly, as I thumbed through stacks of Penguin and vintage classics, inside, I thought he actually was a terrible person. But not only for ebooks. As I browsed, I looked for my own books. A bad habit, I know. One that's bound to disappoint me. My search was briefly interrupted when I found a copy of J.M. Coetzee's Elizabeth Costello, a novel that was a formative influence about a strident, aging writer delivering a series of lectures. I hadn't thought about it in years. Eventually, I found my first novel. Its pages had yellowed to a turmeric shade. Last year, out of boredom, I'd reread passages from that book and was amazed by how dated it was. Not just in its cultural and technological references, but in its arch-ironic style and its confirmation to the prevailing literary mode of that era, what the literary critic James Wood coined as hysterical realism. It seemed like every character in my first novel had been sketched in fluorescent highlighter. More than the fact that my first novel felt dated, I was shocked that my own writing now spanned generations, and that the evolution of my work could be ascribed to generational shifts as much as it could be attributed to personal artistic growth. Pertinent to our conversation of middles, Kay and I were both mid-career, mid-list, not as exciting as a new writer, but not old enough for any golden wristwatches either. Opening this particular copy of my first novel, I let out a sigh when I laid eyes on the logo of the publisher, which had folded a decade ago. I felt like the youngest member of a dying guild. I saw the inscription on the book. It was to Kay, who was no longer in the store. I looked for him, shaking and furious, and saw him outside, standing. I shut the book and replaced it on the shelf. Taking a deep breath, I tried to rationalize his decision to sell his copy of my first novel. I told myself that everyone offloads books, especially friends' books. My own bookcase was swollen by titles I had purchased out of obligation, but were rarely read. I did think Kay was a terrible person, smarmy, intellectually vacant. Isn't it nice to have someone confirm your suspicion of their awfulness? Better to dislike someone without any guilt or ambivalence. So I decided Kay was doing me a favor. When I stepped outside, he was waiting for me. Sorry, book dust makes me sneeze, he said with a shrug. You find anything good? I shook my head. Just the same old names. Some used bookstores feel like graveyards, he said to me as we continued our walk. I remember the first time I found one of my own books in a store. It was heartbreaking. It was inscribed to a friend of mine. His eyes caught mine as he laughed. It felt like a knife to the heart. That was when I was young and foolish and took these things too seriously. For the rest of our walk that afternoon, I wondered whether it wasn't too odd of a coincidence for him to make a remark so connected to my own experience just then in the bookstore. If this were a work of fiction, it wouldn't be coincidental. It would have to be a deliberate provocation. But in life, we experience all sorts of coincidences. We think of a person you haven't seen in years and they appear around the corner. That kind of thing. It only gains significance when we invest meaning to it. In life, you can choose to ignore coincidence, to deny its significance. And that is what I tried to do. Part 2, the lecture. The 3 parts, just to let you know. I didn't hear from Kay again until early in the spring, when he invited me to attend his public lecture. At that point, we were rounding up the first year of our pandemic lives. 365 lazy Sundays, 12 months of takeout dinners and exhaustive Netflix viewing, a year of wearing the same zip-up fleece. Not being able to write, I found myself adopting a series of compulsive behaviors. After periods devoted to needless online shopping and then elaborate meals, I changed course and started intermittent fasting, eating only between 11:30 a.m. and 7:30 p.m. Every day, I also had to hit 10,000 steps on my iPhone fitness app. Even if it meant pacing in circles around my studio apartment for half an hour. Friday nights were for takeout. But the end was near. On social media, I began to see friends in the US and the UK receive their vaccines. In Canada, we were a few months behind, but it was already announced in BC that universities should be returning to face-to-face instruction in the fall. The thing was, as much as I wanted to return to normal, I wasn't sure I was ready. I felt deformed by this experience, like a brain in a vat, someone who didn't really exist on a 3-dimensional plane. I didn't know how to write anymore. I didn't know how to behave in front of a classroom. I was barely functioning as a member of society. I spent over 52 weeks being on edge. I would snap at someone in line at the bank for not covering their nose with their mask. But then at the supermarket, I would give someone else the stink eye. They thought I shouldn't be going in the opposite direction of a one-way supermarket aisle. I was no longer able to behave like a well-socialized human in public, while I was too exhausted for online socializing too. So I had fully intended to skip Kay's keynote, in spite of the personalized invitation he sent me. I included some of our discussion from the walk we took a few months back, he wrote me in a note that accompanied the Zoom link. I'd be honored if you would attend. Telling myself I could include this account on the story of our friendship, the one piece of writing I had on the go, I girded myself and clicked the link. After the moderator made her land acknowledgements, thanked the appropriate people, and read Kay's biography, my old friend appeared on the main screen. As he appeared on my monitor, Kay had buffed himself up ever so slightly. After thanking the audience, his eyes turned to the prepared speech that he read from. The thing I want to talk about today is middles, he said. We find ourselves in the middle of the pandemic, the biggest challenge in my life as a writer and teacher. It's the only thing on our minds, and it's only natural to explore our preoccupations. How do we write about an experience when we are in the middle of it? When I've taught memoir, I've talked about the importance of establishing distance from a story. Sometimes that distance can come from changing points of view or appropriating an alien voice, as in the hermit crab essay. Most often, distance comes from time. It comes, for example, from relating childhood trauma years after the fact as an adult. Writing, for instance, about a bad job after you found a good one. As we all realize now, there is no distance in the middle of a pandemic. Stuck in close quarters indoors with our household members. For students living with roommates or their parents, this distance is ever more difficult to attain. Now we have students experiencing high degrees of stress, their routines and lives upended, their futures put in question, and yet we still want them to turn their cameras on. He paused for laughter, but none came. First off, I want to talk about how to teach in a pandemic, or at least how the pandemic has changed my teaching of creative writing and continued. To start, I find we must speak about process and community more than ever before. Early in my teaching career, I gave little consideration to process. I would have thought that discussing those things was what you did to avoid writing. Better to get into it. Better to use self-loathing and envy as motivation. 20 years as a relatively successful writer have meant wrong turns on manuscripts have eaten away years of my career. In those periods, my work ethic actually counted against me. I forced myself to write every day, even when I had no idea where my stories were going. I could never succeed in outlining, as I would panic whenever I tried to sit down and plan my storyline. Now, when I teach, I try to ask students to distinguish between drafting and writing. Drafting is what most students think of writing. A thing we see in movies about writers, breaking out of their writing funks and blasting out a draft in a sustained period of inspiration. And sure, drafting is probably the most exciting part of the writing process. But it's not all of it. When I talk about writing, I try to talk about what it also encompasses. It's the note-taking, it's the discussions with your peers, it's the outlining. This isn't wasted time. When I first taught, also, the talks I gave about presentation, punctuality, and publications were all framed in the context of what a professional writer did. I came from a more cynical, pragmatic time, and as younger writers speak about the various types of abuse they experience at the hands of more established peers, it became more apparent to me the so-called professional writers could do terrible things and still get everything correct about presentation, punctuality, and publication. It was time to talk about those things from a different standpoint, that of community. Not only do we need to submit our work and do a public reading, we also must learn to attend other people's readings, to give good reads ratings to our friends and request their books to be ordered at libraries. And we can write communally too, in coffee shops and over Zoom. And we can submit our work in shared outdoor spaces too, with Wi-Fi. As community members, we must advocate for other writers, especially those that come from less advantaged groups. We read their books, and this is where I try to speak of another kind of middle. The literary mainstream that centers the experience of a Eurocentric, cisgendered, heteronormative middle class as the default. Writing from within these parameters can be judged on their own merits. Anyone outside of them needs to explain their worlds to the mainstream, to justify it. A successful writer from a marginalized group, be it a Jhumpa Lahiri or an Ivan Coyote, is used as proof that the literary mainstream is a meritocracy. Henceforth, though, aspiring writers from that marginalized group will find themselves pushed to write like the one successful writer from their peer set, as though a single narrative fits all. I propose then, as writing teachers, that we pull the curtains back on our own biases and formative reading experiences. Talk openly about our own backgrounds and learning experiences, and ask our students to share theirs. Challenge the notion of what good writing can be, and how the audience determines what and how and whether we read and write. In his new book, Craft in the Real World, one of the most exciting creative writing manuals I've read, Matthew Salesses writes that craft is not innocent or neutral. When I participate in the sharing and changing of craft, I can only do so by acknowledging my own attraction to certain cultural conventions. Salesses says that to learn craft is to learn how to use cultural expectations to your advantage. The trick is not necessarily to challenge or subvert these conventions, but to acknowledge and allow for other conventions and other audiences to flourish. And now I want to back up a little and consider the question I first posed to myself. How do you write about something when you're still in the middle of it? How do you write in this churn of uncertainty? In fiction, I've found that first-year students often get stuck on narratives that work around finality. They write about murders and car accidents, romantic betrayals and breakups. In those classes, we talk about starting in Medea Res and the open ending of Lady with a Toy Dog by Anton Chekhov. We talk about how lapidary openers and conclusive endings are old-fashioned. One could even argue that literary fiction is nothing but middles. In my more senior classes, I will talk about the most fashionable mode of writing today, that of auto-fiction, where conflict and tension are dismissed as artifice in favor of more digressive inward looks at the creative process and the thin membrane separating invention and autobiography. In most contemporary fiction, progress is marked by an internal shift. I'm going to propose a more radical suggestion for writing when you're still in the middle of something. If you don't like what you're writing in the middle of, write the ending that you'd like to see. Write the characters and instances that will bring about change. At this moment in Kay's speech, I was ready to vomit, figuratively. Here he was suggesting that the emotional temperature taking of literary writing could be swapped out with magical thinking. I knew the Kay of a long time ago, when he was a cynical, apolitical binge drinker. He had not only changed with the times, he was pandering to them. And then something happened during that talk that forced me to be sympathetic towards my rival. The keynote was Zoom bombed. A participant with the screen name Kung Flu Fighter started typing anti-Asian and anti-masking comments in the chat box. Why wasn't this talk set in webinar mode? The moderator's face blanched as she flailed around with the controls until the Zoom bomber was booted from the talk. She apologized profusely, and the chat box began filling up with comments that condemned the Zoom bomber and supported Kay, whose face had grown red as a lychee fruit. Even I felt sympathy toward him then. Sometimes I forget that I existed in a bubble long before COVID-19. Kay eventually stammered out to the online audience. It's one of relative affluence and advanced education has allowed me to avoid confronting the ugliness that other racialized people suffer. As an Asian in Canada, I also partially benefit from a kind of invisibility that has been negated by the pandemic. It's the main reason I didn't want to write as an Asian Canadian writer in my early days and do so more frequently now. I'm grateful, and here you use scare quotes, in some ways for this incident and those perpetrated on others in the past year to be shaken out of my complacency. He laughed to himself, a breathy, shallow laughter. His eyes darted anxiously on screen, as though he didn't know where to look, lest he see another Zoom bomber's racialized comments. I didn't have much more to say. I'm going to stop here. Any questions? There was a pause, as there usually is at these events. And then a few questions began appearing in the chat box, which my old friend dutifully answered. But he seemed noticeably distracted and flustered. The moderator ended the discussion after 2 questions and thanked everyone for attending. Afterwards, I sent Kay a text message congratulating him on his speech. He texted back immediately. The speech had gone terribly, he asserted, even before the racist Zoom bombing. He was unsure that the speech he had made was the one the organizers of the event wanted. To be honest, he texted back, life hasn't been going as good as I made it sound. He and his wife, who was also a teacher, were stressed and worried about face-to-face instruction in a new institution. A recent investment he had made was potentially disastrous. His stepson wanted to move out of the house for his second year of university. They had to find a way to pay for it. His daughter was worried she wouldn't have another birthday party. His aging mother exhausted him. His manuscript, the one that got him through the pandemic, was received negatively by his editor. I've just spent an hour talking as though I had knowledge and certainty to impart, he said. But really, I'm full of doubt. Part 3, class visit. The day after the keynote lecture, I received an invitation from an editor. She was an old friend from university who now headed a glossy Canadian magazine and wanted to commission me to write a story. If there's any benefit to being middle-aged, it might be having friends in positions of influence. The editor wrote that, quote, we would use a good story that relates to quarantine or grocery shopping or some aspect of contemporary life now. There's room for a slice of life, funny West Coast-based thing set in the here and now. I guess I could have said no to my friend. I hadn't written a word besides the account you're hearing now. But the pay rate was nothing I could turn my back on, and deadlines always motivated me. As someone who was used to pitching countless ideas before one was accepted, a commission story is like finding money on the ground. Because of the parameters laid out, I wanted to write a Vancouver story about someone affected by the pandemic. I remembered reading an article about how horoscopes being published in March 2020 were being posted with provisos, warning readers that they'd been written weeks earlier before the pandemic occurred. In other words, don't follow any advice to take risks or take last-second vacations. What if the story was about how a foreteller was affected, I thought to myself. I decided against the protagonist as a tarot card reader because I felt that there would be too many readers who might know more about it than I would, and my superficial research would be too easily exposed. Then I looked into Chinese types of fortune telling because I recalled an experience with a palm reader in Hong Kong many years earlier. But where would the story end? How would it end? Even with the pandemic's end in sight and vaccinations scheduled, it's hard to imagine life in the fall of 2021, much less 2022. I remembered what Kay had said about writing the future I wanted to see. Then I had an idea. I decided the story needed to look back at the pandemic as an event long past, like the flu of 1918. In this way, the immediate aftermath of the pandemic wouldn't be depicted. The story ends with the main character as an old woman recalling this ongoing moment of ours to her granddaughter, decades in the future, as a suppressed memory. For it to work as fiction, I needed to transform the pandemic into a metaphor for the ability to forget as a survival mechanism. That was my favorite part of the story. All the pandemic-related buzzwords would probably make it feel dated. When the story was published, one of the first people to offer their appreciation of the work was Kay. He liked it so much that he assigned the story to one of his in-person classes that fall. He even wanted me to come to his classroom to discuss my story. I hesitated for a day before agreeing to appear in person. I was teaching online that fall, so it'd be my first time on campus in over a year and a half. When I stepped foot into the classroom, everything felt new and old. Some students were still wearing masks. Others were trying to keep 2 meters apart. The students, for the most part, seemed excited to be seeing one another face to face. Things were definitely different, but not altogether changed. Kay, who had a good rapport with his students, began with course housekeeping and introduced me. We've known each other from the beginning, he said. So many years ago now. The class applauded when I stepped up in front of the lectern. I read the story to the class and discussed its writing process, being sure to mention Kay's influence on its ending. I enjoyed standing in front of these students. And for the first time, since I had transitioned to teaching online, I looked forward to teaching in person. Afterwards, Kay asked if he could buy me a beer. I had nowhere to go and I agreed, but I insisted on paying. I didn't tell him that I hadn't been inside a pub in over a year and a half, not even on a patio. The university pub seemed even more normal than I thought it would be. Busy with students anxious to forget the past 2 years of compelled isolation. A mask-wearing server approached us. Should we order a pitcher, I asked. Kay shrugged. I can only have one, he said. I need to pick up my daughter from school. I ordered 2 pints instead, realizing we'd be one and done. Kay thanked me for the reading. Oh, I almost forgot. He was carrying a messenger bag and placed it on his lap. From it, he removed 2 books, Elizabeth Costello and my first novel. I know you're a big fan of Kutsaya's. I wasn't sure you read this one, Kay said. I told him that I wanted to reread the book ever since I heard his talk. Kay explained that he had been back in Carson's books recently, in spite of his allergy to dust, where he found both titles. I picked up your own novel out of curiosity, and when I opened it, I saw my own name. I laughed, feigning surprise. It was all an accident, Kay explained. Don't think I sold my copy of your book. I would never do something like that, not without tearing out the inscription. When he last moved, Kay explained, he had donated the wrong box of books, which included my own first novel, to the Salvation Army. Somehow, the book must have been purchased and resold to Carson's. It's well-traveled, yet it's come home to me, he said. I flipped through the book again and saw my old description to my old friend, written at the outset of our friendship. Hope you like this. Great meeting you. For Kay, who preferred ebooks, it was another coincidence to be reunited with this book, an even greater one than my own stumbling onto it. Were these two coincidences significant? I won't say, but put together, they do provide a resolution. And watching my friend tip his glass as though it were 20 years ago, I decided to take it at face value. When the bill came, we debated over who should pay. We could fight to pay the bill like two Chinese men, but we are too westernized for it to feel true. Ultimately, we split it down the middle, which felt like a fitting end to this story. Thank you very much for listening to my talk. I'm going to stop my screen share and ready for the next part.
Oh, that was terrific. Thanks, Kevin. I think we should all applaud, although you can't hear anything. There would be lots of applaud. And it's too bad you couldn't. We were in the same room, because I don't know about everybody else, but there was many times I just guffawed. I was just laughing. So when you put up the slide saying, no one laughed, I thought, oh, it's the Zoom world for sure. So thanks. What a wonderful metafictional nested talk. It was just terrific.
I'm really glad.
Yeah, it was really just so enjoyable. I just loved it. So we can certainly take any questions in the chat if anybody would like to throw anything in there. People are applauding in their living rooms.
That's very kind.
Oh, it was just wonderful. Yeah.
Thanks everyone for making it out. Like us, Thursday night is not always the best time to be out, and just on a screen again. So deeply appreciate it.
I know. Anyone have a question for Kevin or anything you want to ask? Or
well, why don't I sort of kill some time and talk a little bit about writing this. In some ways, it was a great opportunity to actually try to write fiction, after like a fall term in which it was very hard to write, much less think. And it's because we were in the middle of things, and so I had to put a lot of thoughts in. And when I was, confronted with the task of writing this lecture, I thought it would be good try not to deliver a standard speech. And then quickly I toggled back to some of my sort of formative writing influences as a young man, and that includes like J.M. Coetzee's novels, like Elizabeth Costello, and also the novels of Philip Roth, like his sort of mid-period novels where he was doing a lot of sort of mirror games with his Zuckerman character and his dual Philip Roth characters. And Paul Auster is another sort of metafictional writer too. And so it's kind of great fun writing it, but it's also interesting to be writing metafiction and realize that it's very much like a running theme in all my fiction and my 3 novels and my 4th one. It's also kind of in some ways a dated sort of approach. It's not necessarily the one that's in the forefront that we're seeing on the vanguard of literary writing too. So that's in some ways like the things that were sort of churning in my mind when I was writing. I got to throw in some of my anxieties about everything and personalized and sort of global, and so it was cathartic in a way.
And you got in some really, good writing advice. Like I think that, that piece of advice about if you're bored of where you're going in the middle of something, like right the end that you want to go to is I think really interesting. And then they work for poetry too. Like you get a certain point in the poem where you have to turn it in some ways, and so you need to shake it up.
With nonfiction, you kind of think to yourself, everything that happened, and so if there isn't a great ending in what happened, there's not a great ending, but it's how you see what happened in the past or how you can sort of project into the future. You can say, use the conditional tense and imagine a possible ending, and that's something I always encourage my students to do, to speculate, to use your imagination, but couch it in the language that sort of signals to the reader that what you're writing is sort of not necessarily factual, but like projection.
You talked about metafiction as being a bit dated now, but in a way, auto-fiction is a kind of metafiction too, isn't it? Like it's
Oh yeah,
Kind
yeah.
of made the new version of a metafictional sort of look at, or technique, right?
I would think so. Like they in the 80s they had what, dirty realism, and that was kind of like the Hemingway style redux, and there's a slight sort of generational shift and tang to it that makes it a little different, and but it was basically the same thing in terms of approach or in terms of the language. And with metafiction and autofiction, they're kind of related in some ways. Autofiction, I think, dispenses even further with the mechanics of plot, but like what we see as plot as literary writers, like I think an outside reader might not see as very plotted. Like a well plotted literary thriller is not well plotted compared to like an airport thriller, for instance.
That's good. Good point. Yeah. Anybody else have any comments or questions or just something they want to say?
Nancy,
I see some open.
Oh, sorry.
I saw some open questions right now. There are 3 that are open.
Oh, okay. I can't see in them.
It's under, I think, Q&A.
Yeah,
okay, sorry, yeah. Okay, so here they are. Do you want to tackle them, Kevin? Can you see them there?
Yes.
Okay.
So the first one is, would you consider this keynote fiction or nonfiction or another genre? I think it, you could call it metafiction. You could probably call it autofiction too, because it sort of plays around with the idea of it being autobiographical, and it takes a lot of my own sort of life as grist for the mill. Like both the characters in the story are in some ways autobiographical sort of projections of myself. Like the K character is more like me now, but there's elements of the narrator in me as well. Like as someone who was in some much more cynical. There's a part of me that's like, that is, yay people, yay students, yay everything. There's a part of me that's the undercurrent. There's a part of me that, that whose formative experiences were around these sort of male writers, who didn't think art was political because art was about individual freedom. I think that was like the modus operandi of like someone like Philip Roth, for instance, personal liberty, escaping from the bonds of a rigid social Jewish identity. And his idea of personal freedom involved, having sex with a lot of women, like without any sort of repercussions, and you can see with the sort of brouhaha that's existed, that's come in the sort of wake of his biography, that like that time has no longer sort of occurs, and so I would consider this like, if you had to like call it one or the other, probably fiction, but probably autofiction as well, to replace these sort of mirror games.
Which kind of leads into the next question. You write fiction, memoir, and now autofiction. Can you talk about the relationship of each to truth and or fiction?
Yeah. Like I think like autofiction is definitely something that I'm basically just doing for this talk, as far as I can tell. But I think, I think somebody like David Shields in Reality Hunger argued that fiction and memoir fiction and nonfiction are interchangeable, because nonfiction always involves invention. Even when you're remembering something, you're trying to remember it as best as you can. You're always inventing. Whereas fiction always draws from real life. So they're basically the same thing. They're just coming at it from 2 different directions. And I think that's simplistic. I think with memoir or creative nonfiction, you're trying to be truthful. You're trying to be as ethically rigorous as possible. And it reads differently, I think, too. I think there's much more of a sort of expectation of sort of information in nonfiction, of being taught something in nonfiction. Although I tell my students not to avoid information in nonfiction, to have voices and layers instead of information and factlets, with fiction, I think with narrative, you internalize these rules of structure in storytelling, even if you're not doing it perfectly, you still have some rough sense of it. You're not following it beat by beat in the same way as a screenwriter is, and the conflicts aren't as externalized, but you're still sort of reproducing these internalized structures. I think you're doing that with memoir and narrative nonfiction as well. Essay has a kind of has a structure as well, and has a kind of a peak, but it's not as event driven, more reflective. I think autofiction tries not to have like a plot, and I think some autofiction doesn't do it. I think like I think a lot of people say Rachel Cusk doesn't have like like a storyline in her like outline trilogy, for instance. But there, I feel like there's just these moments of intensity that she works towards, which I think are really beautiful. So those are my ramblings that may or may not have answered the questions.
Great. Next question's great too. I don't know if you.
Okay. Do you have any advice for people who are having trouble reading these days, getting beyond doom scrolling? I've taken a real pleasure in reading. I don't know, just because I've run out of TV shows to watch, you know, and I'm not trying to read, you know, towards the pandemic, and I'm not trying to like sort of read a book like the one I wrote in 2018, for instance, and cope with that. I just try to read anything that is really good. You know, I'm not trying to read anything that's escapist. I'm not trying to read anything that is light or plot driven or whatever. I just want to read things that I think are amazing, you know. And sometimes for me, that's reading like the writers that I avoided when I was like a young man in my 20s and 30s. And I almost exclusively read, you know, white male American authors up to a certain age. And now I try to like avoid that, you know. And I think that's something that I do just as my own sort of self-education. And so I don't have great advice, Holly. I'm sorry, but yeah, getting beyond that doom scrolling for me, like I just have to do it. I try to get through it, and then I have my fill and I move beyond it. I felt that after Joseph Biden was elected in the U.S., I spent a lot less time doom scrolling, even though things are still doomy. I felt like there wasn't like a narcissist attention hog like humaning every social media channel. So that sort of gave me some breathing space.
Great. And the next question is kind of funny. Is finding your own book signed to someone else in a used bookstore a real fear of yours?
It's a fear that really happened, you know, and I remember it happened at a younger age, and it was to someone I knew, you know, and like the person at the bookstore wanted me to sign the book, not knowing it had already been signed and inscribed. I knew who the person was, and I was so like insulted and flustered. And I remember just sort of saying, "Oh, I know this person," blah blah blah. And it became a story in the bookstore, like this, that Kevin Chong showed up to the bookstore to sign his own book, and he was like signed to a friend of his, you know. And I wish I could have played it cooler, but I didn't, and it was really silly. And now I realize, I think when you're younger and it's your first book, I think you're much more precious, which is a not kind way of saying it, but you're much prouder of your work, and you're much prouder of your friends' work, and you read all your friends' works, and you talk about it, and you're all excited about to be on this sort of ride together. And then as the books sort of accumulate and you accumulate more friends, then you have so many books, and sometimes you don't have the time for them. Sometimes you're not in the right mood for them. So you buy them and you put them on the shelf, and then your shelves get really cluttered. I've never sold a friend's book ever. You know, I think I've given away like some acquaintances' books, people I don't like necessarily that I bought out of obligation. And I've tried to, in those cases, like tear out the inscription page. But I just have like a lot of books right now, and I am an ebook reader. That's another sort of fact that's been ripped from my own life.
Great. Questions from Jenna Campbell. Hi, Kevin. Really enjoyed listening to this piece. It made me reflect on how the majority of writing takes place in the middle stage, which can feel excruciating or never ending at times. I was wondering if you could speak to getting through your first middle stages in some of your early works and if your methods have changed over time.
Have my methods changed over time? Yes and no. I think for me, like getting to the middle stages is like a frenzy, and I feel like a lot of writers get into that frenzy where they just have to get sort of sucked into that world and be completely engrossed by their book and their own world and their characters. And I think that's why, when people think of writing, it's like that sort of first draft stage, and you're writing every day in your undershirt, and it's really exciting. But that's like 10% of the writing life, the rest of it's just waiting for edits, doing edits, like waiting for your friend to respond, and like I think I try not to force it as much now. I feel like I had a lot of anxiety around writing fiction and writing a manuscript, and I find different ways to cheat around it. I think writing nonfiction was really useful for me because I'm really good with writing deadlines. And I think for The Plague, I approached Brian Lamb at Arsenal Pulp, who had previously published my second novel, and said, just give me a contract for no money, but I just want to publish it in 2018, and what would be the deadline for that? And he gave me a deadline, and I knew I worked well with the deadline. So I sort of fooled myself into writing a book really quickly. And now I don't feel like I necessarily need that anymore. I just need to sort of land on an idea and let it sort of turn around in my head long enough. And I feel like I'm calm enough inside, and I can actually not get too worried once I start something, and not sort of sabotage myself.
Okay. Next question's from Ashley Little. Hi, Kevin. In your career as a writer, not teaching, what would you consider to be your greatest regret or failure? What do you consider to be your greatest achievement?
My greatest regret or failure, I feel like as a young writer, the things that I'm most embarrassed about are sort of like moments of immaturity where, in the name of satire, in the name of being sort of edgy, I was mean to a type of person or someone that seemed different to me. And I think back at those moments in my writing and in my interactions, and I really reflect on that a lot. Sometimes it's things that bother me at night. I sort of relive things that I said, and I think that really something I have to sort of live with and try to like do better. In terms of my greatest achievement, oh geez, I don't think I've got like one thing that's like, wow, this is like awesome. I think just continuing to write, 20 years now, like into my third decade, I think is my the thing I'm proudest of, because I know a lot of people find reasons not to write, and I can find reasons not to write, and we get sort of swept away in different things in our families and in our obligations and in our work, that we don't make the time to write, and we get discouraged and we stop. And so persisting and continuing and sort of seeing that there are lots of ups and downs, and writing through those downs, I would say is my greatest achievement.
Thanks, Kevin. And how about, here's our last question.
There's some
Sharon.
in the chat box too, I think.
Oh, it's some in the chat. Okay.
Okay.
So this is the last Q&A. So let's do that one first. From Sharon Halcrow. Do you find you live your life always thinking, I could write about this? And if so, does that affect the decisions you make?
Yeah, I do. you know, like especially when I was like a freelance writer. I guess I still am a freelance writer. I still do things, you know, and people ask me to. And I still sort of see things that happen to me in terms of whether it could be a pitch for a story or whether it could be a story itself. And when you're in a moment where you think, wow, this is like, you know, has all the workings of a scene, you know, you start, you know, your gears start turning in your head, you know, and I think that's the occupational hazard of being a writer, and it's the hazard of being associated with a writer if you're a non-writer, you know, insofar as people are seeing the experience that you're sharing with them and they're, you know, using it as grist for their own creative work. And as a result, you know, like you can sort of hurt friendships. You can kind of exhaust people. You can kind of like you kind of have to learn to say sorry, you know, and sometimes you seek permission before you publish things. Sometimes you do it and then you apologize afterwards, hope that they accept your apology. Sometimes you expect them to write their own version someday and you realize you have to live with it at the time when it comes out. But yeah, I think that's being a writer, you know, like it's I forget what Janet Malcolm said about writers just being like, or journalists being like so opportunistic, but you know, like that's something that popped into my head as well, you know. Yeah.
Great question. Here's a question in the chat from Denise. I love metafiction, dated or not. As a performance person, the self-reflexivity is appreciated in the moment. I also love that I could just listen to a story. I love being told a story. This is a live performance. Did the knowing that you were going to perform this influence your writing process?
Yeah, you know, like I did. You know, I didn't want to write something that had too much dialogue because like performing a piece with dialogue it has a little too much like of that sort of doing two different sort of inflections that I really enjoy doing. So I thought of it as a more expository piece of fiction. Um, like it's been a busy term, so I wrote this first draft like a month ago, and then I sort of did some line edits maybe 2 weeks ago, and then this afternoon I penned in some line edits. But as I was reading it, you know, like the thing I tell my students to do that I don't do often enough is to read your work aloud. You just learn so much about your own work. You just learn like where all the errors are, all the repetitions, all the typos, uh, and you know how it sounds. It's like a different version of the story once you hear it aloud. And so I was sort of self-editing as I was reading it too, which was an experience as well. It sort of kept me awake in a way. I'm not performing it like an actor does, you know, and I think that's kind of my style, you know. Like I once wrote a book about Neil Young because he was such a formative aesthetic influence in my life, and for me, like that kind of like the broken up reading with sort of bumbled words and is like my version of the glitchy guitar solo with the bum notes and it, you know, I feel like it's okay because it's my sound, it's more authentic, you know. And so I never take like too many pains to like read things in a way where it could be like radio ready or anything like that. I just feel like I'm not a performer. I've never, you know, like I remember the first time I saw Ivan Coyote read, and it blew my mind that like, why is this person reading without looking at the page? You know, why are they looking at the audience? That is so unusual. And meanwhile, the audience is all transfixed. You know, I'd rather just sit here hunched over and bumble every third sentence. You know, like that's, I know that I don't have that talent, and I know that I've seen like Shane Koizan like in the green room at a writers festival get ready, and he just seems like he needs to like meditate and concentrate and not everyone talk to him. Whereas I just want to like, you know, drink beer and chat with people and get chips on my shirt before reading. So I don't want to like ruin that. You know, like I don't think I could be as good as either Shane or Ivan anyhow. So I'm very accepting of my imperfections, and I think that's in some ways my strength and my weakness as a writer. You know, I think it's my strength insofar as I can just get through things and get things out, but then I also make errors and I flub things. I probably should go over things one more time, you know, but that's kind of like one thing I'm learning about. I'm doing this new novel, and the approach that I'm trying out is to try to like get it as buffed as possible before I get it to the next stage, you know, like, and so I've hired like freelance editors using like the startup money from my new job, and so I had two like freelance rounds, and then I signed with a new agent, and I've got, you know, agent notes now, and so this is like the first book I've ever submitted where it's going to be like, I think like on its sixth draft by the time, you know, like it's submitted. But I feel at this stage in my career very mid-list, you know, like that's how maybe I'm gonna like attract new business, you know, by, you know, really bringing out the best, which is not usually what I do. I just sort of like throw things out there and see if anyone sort of responds to it.
Interesting. Okay, another question here. Thank you for this is from Sharon Franklin. Thank you for your talk. In 2020, did you consider opening a pandemic consultancy for, say, grocers and how to set up stores for non-contagion? It's a smiley face. Actually, I'd like to ask you about how you did your research about pandemics. Thank you.
Yeah, it's not that, you know, I wasn't as thorough as I could have been because I was reading how Salima Nawaz wrote, I'm just totally forgetting, Songs of, can't forget the name of the title. Anyhow, it's a pandemic novel that was published last year, much more timely. Songs for the End of the World. Thank you, Anne. And you know, she found all these sort of UN sort of like reports and contingency plans. I remember I tried to look for those things, but my researching ability, I think, was much more limited. I remember talking to some doctors about why they were doctors and what kind of work they did. And I met with one in the mall. I met with a former student who became a doctor. And that was really interesting to me, you know, like in terms of like why someone chose their job. But in terms of researching a pandemic, I just thought it was not feasible, you know, like that is how not prophetic I was, you know, like, and I called it the bubonic plague because I didn't want to invent some sort of like name like SARS or something. I didn't want it to be necessarily plausible. I wanted it to operate on a level of metaphor, and I wanted it to be, you know, plausible enough that people weren't just like throwing the book like to the ground because like, oh yeah, no, people wouldn't be doing that, you know. But it's really interesting now that, you know, people are you know, living through a pandemic and they can fact check the things I got wrong, which are many. I did have people lining up outside the liquor store, you know, and I remember thinking whenever I drive and I see people lining up outside the liquor store, I'm like, I got that one right, that people really want to drink when there's a pandemic. And I'm so proud of myself for something that is very self-evident. And so, yeah, I think that is like my thoughts on research. You know, and I sort of like I've done nonfiction books that have involved a lot of research, and I think it's really good to like in those books that I framed myself as the person who didn't know anything and he was learning things as he went along. Because sometimes I misunderstood things that I learned. You know, sometimes I garbled things that I learned. Apparently, people would send me letters suggesting things that I got wrong, and I think that's kind of interesting. And I work into future editions when there are some, and it's, you know, it's interesting to try to research and try to like step out of the house. You know, like I I did read the new Philip Roth biography, and like his process was that with some books he would just go out and he'd write the book, write a draft, and then he would do research to confirm whether he got things right or wrong, you know. But then with other books, he would find people who he could interview, and then he would produce really beautiful passages. Like there was like a really beautiful passage about glove making in American Pastoral, which I thought was one of the finest parts of that really good book, you know. And so I think people have different processes. I think even if you're researching the past, I'm teaching a novel writing class at UBCO next year, and one of the articles that I linked to involves, you know, like having like 2 factual elements for every one fictional element that you bring into your historical novel. I think that's an interesting approach. You know, you're not going to be 1% like research. You're going to use that to sort of produce a kind of like this pedestal for your imagination to, you know, soar, hopefully.
Nice. Yeah, Emma Donohue's new novel too. She must. I was just thinking about that when you were talking. Her novel was about the flu pandemic in 1918. It was. I felt to me, it felt like it was just chock full of research. But I guess she has a lot of medical people in her life too. But it was just pretty graphic and detailed and factual and kind of scary.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes it can be too clunky, and it could just be like someone just dumping research onto the page.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes, you know, like it can be this beautiful imagery, and I think that's the kind of hard research that you can't necessarily get from like opening a history book. It's kind of like looking through microfiche for a picture of that period and finding a little detail in the corner of the picture or an ad. You know, like I remember like writing my book about Northern Dancer, and there are all these like ads about, you know, like hats, you know, and capturing that sort of like era of people wearing hats, you know, and just realizing where we were in that time. And I think that was really useful.
Nice. Well, I don't think there's any more questions, but there's a nice comment from Nancy Square here. I found a used copy of Kevin's book, Beauty Plus Pity, in Powell's Books in Portland, and wondered about its journey to get there. Oops.
I don't think the book was released in the US. I don't think I ever did a reading in Portland. I think I did one in Seattle. So could have just gone down the I-5, you know, like the best was when I think Aslan Hunter sent me a picture of it in Italy. You know, I think that was like a nice trip for the book to take, you know, and especially if you don't have a book that was published in Italy, you know, I think that's kind of neat to see that, you know.
Wonderful. Well, Kevin, thank you so much. It's been just a wonderful evening. And yeah, I just enjoyed everything from the readings to the questions to the answers. So thank you so much.
Well, it's my pleasure.
Yeah.
I want to thank all the people who've come to this event, especially friends and familiars. I really appreciate it, you know, like that you've tolerated me in your personal lives and now on your screens. And those of you I haven't met as participants, I hope we do meet some point, you know, hopefully in Kelowna.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And that ends our second annual Sharon Thesen Lecture for 2021 with Kevin Chong.
Bye, folks.